My parents and golden child brother ambushed me at Sunday dinner, demanding I hand over the keys to the house I paid for so he could live there. I left quietly, but they didn't know I had already transferred the massive mortgage. This is where the story truly begins, and you won't want to miss what happens. Make sure you're subscribed to see it through to the end. We're always curious. Where in the world are you all watching from today? Let us know in the comments. The pounding in my temples was a relentless, rhythmic drumbeat, syncing perfectly with the ticking of the grandfather clock in the dining room. I had just come off an 80-hour work week at the financial firm. The screens, the spreadsheets, the endless conference calls with overseas clients. It had all culminated in a migraine so blindingly painful that the dining room chandelier felt like a spotlight interrogating me. I had driven over to the house purely out of a sense of obligation. Sunday dinner was an institution in our family, a mandatory attendance event that my mother, Margaret, enforced with a velvet-covered iron fist. All I wanted was to eat my portion of the dry roast beef, nod politely at whatever trivial family gossip was being shared, and retreat to my bedroom upstairs to sleep for 12 uninterrupted hours. I sat at the polished mahogany table, pushing a scoop of mashed potatoes around my plate. My father, William, sat at the head of the table, clearing his throat with a loud, authoritative scrape that always signaled a pronouncement was imminent. Across from me sat my older brother, Gabriel. He was 31, yet he carried himself with the unearned swagger of a teenage lottery winner. He was leaning back in his chair, swirling a glass of sparkling water, a sickeningly smug smile playing on his lips. "Lucy," William said, his voice dropping an octave to that serious, paternal tone he used when he wanted to sound like the patriarch of a dynasty, rather than a retired mid-level manager. "Put your fork down. We have family business to discuss." I winced, pressing 2 fingers to my throbbing temple. "Can it wait until after dinner, Dad? My head is splitting." "I've been staring at financial models since 5 in the morning on Thursday." "No, it cannot wait," William replied coldly. He didn't even blink at the mention of my exhaustion. "It is about this house, the family home." The phrase family home always grated on my nerves, considering the reality of the situation, but I was too tired to correct him. I sighed and set my fork down, letting the silver clink against the fine china. "Okay, what about the house?" Margaret leaned forward, her face arranged in an expression of forced, tragic sympathy. "You know your brother has been going through a transition period, Lucy. His latest venture didn't yield the results he anticipated, and his landlord is being terribly unreasonable about the lease." I looked at Gabriel. His latest venture was a high-end dropshipping company that sold overpriced, rebranded vitamins online, which had inevitably collapsed when his supplier vanished. "So," I asked, my voice flat, "he needs to borrow money again." "No," William interjected sharply, slapping his palm flat on the table. The water glasses vibrated. "Gabriel does not need a handout. He needs stability. He needs a place to build his empire without the crushing burden of overhead. This house," he gestured broadly to the formal dining room, the high ceilings, the expensive crown molding, "is too large for just one single woman. It is wasteful." My stomach performed a slow, sickening flip. The pain in my head sharpened into a needle of ice. "Wasteful? What are you talking about?" William leaned in, his eyes locked on mine with absolute, chilling resolve. "Leave your keys and get out," he demanded. "This house belongs to the family now. Gabriel needs it more than you do." I stared at him, unable to process the words. I looked at Margaret, expecting her to soften the blow, to tell me it was a misunderstanding. Instead, my mother slowly, deliberately nodded in agreement. The betrayal was worse than the diagnosis itself. The silence that followed was suffocating. The only sound in the room was the low hum of the refrigerator in the adjacent kitchen and the heavy thudding of my own heart against my ribs. I felt a cold sweat break out across the back of my neck. My breath caught in my throat, refusing to move past the sudden, hard lump that had formed there. I looked from William's stern, unyielding face to Margaret's placid, nodding head, and finally to Gabriel. Gabriel wasn't even trying to hide his delight. He took a slow, theatrical sip of his water, his eyes gleaming with triumphant malice. "Look, Lucy, don't make a big emotional scene about this," he said, waving his hand dismissively as if swatting away a gnat. "It's just practical. I need the space." The master suite gets incredible natural light, which is exactly what I need for my new content studio. I've already got contractors lined up to knock down the wall between your bedroom and the guest room to make an open concept workspace. My bedroom? He was already planning to demolish the walls of the room where I slept, the room I had carefully decorated with my hard-earned bonuses. The sheer audacity of it left me temporarily paralyzed. "You're kicking me out," I whispered, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "Tonight, you're telling me to leave my own home tonight." "It is not your home, Lucy," William corrected, his voice dripping with condescension. "It is the family's home. You have been permitted to stay here, but the family's needs have shifted. Gabriel is the priority right now. You have a good job. You can easily find a little apartment downtown closer to your office. It makes perfect logistical sense." "Exactly," Margaret chimed in, her voice artificially sweet, the way one might speak to a slow child. "And to make things easier, you don't have to worry about packing everything meticulously right this second. You can use those heavy-duty black garbage bags for your clothes tonight. It's so much faster, and it will allow Gabriel to start moving his production equipment in first thing tomorrow morning." Garbage bags. They wanted me to pack the life I had built into garbage bags and disappear into the night so my unemployed, grifting brother could play CEO in my master suite. The physical sickness intensified. My hands were trembling violently in my lap. I wanted to scream. I wanted to flip the heavy mahogany table over and shatter the fine china they were eating off of. I wanted to list every single grueling sacrifice I had made for them. But as I looked at their expectant faces, waiting for my tears, waiting for me to break down and beg for their mercy, a strange, terrifying calm washed over me. The trembling in my hands ceased. The migraine pulsing behind my eyes dulled into a cold, sharp clarity. I realized in that exact moment that these people were not my family. They were parasites, and they were utterly, completely delusional. I didn't say a word. I reached into my designer handbag, my fingers brushing past my financial planner and my office access badge, until I found the heavy, jingling keyring. Slowly, I pulled it out. I unclipped the heavy brass front door key, the garage fob, and the back patio key. The clatter of the metal hitting the polished wood of the dining table sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. I stood up, smoothing the wrinkles from my skirt. I didn't look at William, Margaret, or Gabriel again. I simply turned on my heel and walked out the front door, stepping into the cool night air. I climbed into my car, started the engine, and looked back at the large, beautiful house illuminated by the porch lights. They thought they had won. They thought they had successfully bullied me into surrendering my greatest asset, but they had forgotten one crucial thing. As I drove away from the house, the streetlights rhythmically flashing across the windshield, the memories of how we arrived at this pathetic juncture flooded my mind. The house they were currently celebrating their takeover of was not a family heirloom. It wasn't passed down through generations. 5 years ago, William and Margaret had found themselves on the brink of absolute ruin. William had made a series of disastrous, high-risk investments based on a tip from one of his golf buddies, entirely draining his retirement and heavily mortgaging their previous, modest home. When the market corrected, they were left with nothing but foreclosure notices. I was 29 at the time, freshly promoted to a mid-level analyst role, finally starting to see the financial rewards of my 80-hour weeks, the missed vacations, the sacrificed social life. When Margaret called me, sobbing hysterically about being thrown onto the street, I did what any dutiful, brainwashed daughter would do. I stepped in. Using my impeccable credit, a massive chunk of my savings for a down payment, and my substantial income, I purchased the beautiful, sprawling house in the suburbs. I moved them in, taking the master suite for myself to justify the immense financial burden I had taken on. I paid the staggering $780,000 mortgage entirely on my own, every single month, while they lived rent-free. buying groceries and maintaining the illusion of their comfortable, upper-middle-class lifestyle. And Gabriel? Gabriel did absolutely nothing. Gabriel was the quintessential golden child, entirely shielded from the consequences of his actions by our mother's relentless coddling and our father's delusion that his son was a dormant genius. Gabriel was handsome, I'll give him that, tall, with a perfectly manicured beard and an expensive haircut he maintained weekly. He dressed impeccably in tailored suits and designer streetwear, all financed by high-interest credit cards that our parents secretly helped him pay off. Professionally, Gabriel was a chameleon of failure. He was a life coach until he realized it required listening to other people's problems. He was a crypto investor until he lost $30,000 of our parents' remaining cash in a blatant pump-and-dump scheme. He was an app developer for 2 years, pitching a revolutionary social media platform that never made it past a heavily plagiarized wireframe design. He always had a pitch deck, he always used buzzwords like synergy and disruptive tech, and he always looked down on my career. "You're just a cog in the machine, Lucy," he would tell me, adjusting a Rolex he had bought secondhand but claimed was a gift from a non-existent mentor. "You push paper for other people's wealth. I'm building a legacy. I'm building an empire." His arrogance was entirely unearned, but it was incredibly effective at manipulating our parents. They viewed his spectacular failures not as incompetence, but as the inevitable growing pains of a visionary. They viewed my stable, grueling, highly lucrative career as boring and safe. I was just the family's ATM, a dull necessity meant to fund Gabriel's brilliant ascent. I remember a specific conversation just 3 months ago. I was in the kitchen, exhausted, drinking a glass of water when Gabriel cornered me. He had leaned against the marble counter, his eyes darting around the expensive appliances. "You know, Lucy," he had said, his voice slick and casual, "this property has appreciated significantly since you bought it. Have you ever thought about tapping into the equity? I have a phenomenal opportunity in real estate tokenization, but I need capital. If you transferred the deed to a family trust, I could leverage it for a massive return. We could all be rich." I had laughed in his face and walked away. I thought it was just another one of his idiotic grifts. I hadn't realized that the seed had been planted. He hadn't stopped thinking about my equity. When he couldn't convince me to willingly hand over the capital, he simply changed tactics. He convinced William and Margaret that because I was family, and because they lived there, the house was inherently theirs to control. He convinced them that they had the authority to evict the very person keeping a roof over their heads. They had bought his lies completely. But as my car merged onto the highway, heading toward a luxury hotel downtown where I could finally sleep in peace, I didn't feel like a victim anymore. I felt a cold, calculating thrill. Gabriel thought he was a mastermind. He thought his polished veneer and smooth talking had secured him a nearly $1 million asset. He had no idea what a real financial maneuver looked like. I woke up the next morning in a massive, king-sized bed at the Four Seasons downtown. The sheets were crisp, the room was perfectly silent, and the sheer, heavy blackout curtains blocked out the morning sun. For the first time in years, the crushing, invisible weight of that suburban house was completely gone from my chest. I ordered room service, a pot of black coffee and a plate of fresh fruit, and sat by the floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the city skyline. I opened my laptop, the screen illuminating my face with a cool, blue glow, and logged into my secure banking portal. There it was. A pending wire transfer for my full equity payout, sitting safely in my private accounts. My parents and Gabriel had been so blinded by their entitlement, so thoroughly convinced that my silence was submission, that they had entirely misread my behavior over the last month. As a financial analyst, I dealt with hostile takeovers and toxic asset offloading on a daily basis. When Gabriel had first started dropping hints about leveraging the house 3 months ago, I didn't just ignore him. I ran a risk assessment. I saw the writing on the wall. I knew it was only a matter of time before they attempted to force my hand, perhaps by refusing to leave, or worse, trying to forge my signature on secondary loan documents. So, I preemptively struck. 3 weeks ago, I quietly listed the property on an exclusive, off-market commercial network. Given the location and the lot size, a ruthless, corporate property management firm swooped in with an aggressive all-cash offer. We closed the deal on Friday afternoon. I signed the final paperwork, transferred the deed, and officially walked away from the property. The $780,000 mortgage wasn't mine anymore. It had been fully paid off by the corporate buyers, who were now transferring the property into their massive portfolio. By demanding my keys and officially claiming the house last night, William, Margaret, and Gabriel had essentially declared themselves unauthorized squatters to a billion-dollar real estate conglomerate. I took a long, slow sip of my coffee, savoring the bitter, rich taste. But taking the house out from under them wasn't enough. I needed to ensure Gabriel could never financially abuse our parents or anyone else again. I pulled up my phone and dialed a number I hadn't used in a few years. It was a private investigator I sometimes contracted for corporate background checks, a former forensic accountant named David. "Lucy," David's gruff voice answered on the second ring. "It's early for you. Who are we looking into?" "Gabriel," I said flatly. "I need a complete, unregulated deep dive into his financials. LLCs, shell companies, credit history, pending litigation. I want to know exactly what his latest venture is and, more importantly, who he owes money to." "Your brother." David sounded surprised, but I heard the rapid clicking of a keyboard in the background. "Give me a few hours. If he's leaving a paper trail, I'll find the breadcrumbs." While David worked, I took a long, hot shower, the steam loosening the remaining tension in my shoulders. I dressed in a sharp, tailored navy suit. If I was going to war today, I was going to wear my armor. By the time I was drying my hair, my phone buzzed with an encrypted file from David. I opened it, and my eyes widened at the sheer scale of Gabriel's deception. Gabriel didn't just have a failed dropshipping company. He was drowning in nearly $200,000 of high-interest, unsecured debt from predatory lenders. But the most sickening revelation was hidden on page 4 of the report. The contractors he claimed he had hired to remodel my bedroom. They weren't contractors. They were aggressive debt collectors who had tracked him down and were threatening to seize assets. He needed my house not to build a studio, but to secure a massive, fraudulent loan to pay off men who were ready to break his legs. And worse, David had uncovered 3 newly opened credit cards maxed out to the limit. The primary account holder, Margaret. He was bleeding our parents dry, right under their noses. At precisely 10:15 a.m., my cell phone began to vibrate violently on the glass desk of my hotel room. The caller ID flashed William's number. I let it ring 4 times, letting the suspense build, before finally swiping the screen and answering with a calm, perfectly modulated voice. "Hello, Dad." "Lucy, what in the absolute hell is going on?" William's voice didn't just boom, it cracked with a frantic, unhinged panic I had never heard from him before. In the background, I could hear Margaret crying hysterically. "I'm at work, Dad," I lied smoothly, staring out at the city. "Is there a problem with the keys? I left them on the dining table exactly as you asked." "The keys?" William screamed, the sound distorting the phone's speaker. "The mortgage company just called, and then 10 minutes later, 2 men in suits showed up at the front door. They handed me a formal eviction notice. They said they represent Vanguard Property Holdings and that we have 72 hours to vacate the premises or we will be removed by the sheriff." "Oh yes," I replied, feigning mild surprise. "I sold the house to Vanguard on Friday." The $780,000 mortgage was transferred and closed out this morning. "Since you so forcefully claimed the property last night, I assumed you were prepared to negotiate a new commercial lease with them. I believe their standard rate for that square footage is about $9,000 a month." "You sold it," William gasped, the air seemingly punched out of his lungs. "You sold the family home. You can't do that. Gabriel needs this house. He has contractors coming today." "Dad," I said, my voice dropping its polite veneer and turning sharp as a scalpel. "The house was solely in my name. You have no legal rights to it. And as for Gabriel's contractors, why don't you ask him what company they work for? There was a muffled scuffling sound on the other end of the line, and then Gabriel's voice came through, high-pitched and laced with pure venom. "You vindictive, selfish bitch." Gabriel spat. "You planned this. You set me up. I'm going to sue you for breach of verbal contract. I have witnesses. Mom and Dad heard you agree to leave the house to me." "I didn't agree to anything, Gabriel. I just left," I countered, leaning back in my chair. "And good luck finding a lawyer to take a fabricated verbal contract case against a multinational real estate firm. But let's talk about court, Gabriel. I'd love to see you under oath. I was reviewing some financial documents this morning. Tell me, how exactly are you planning to pay back the $200,000 you owe to Apex Lending? Are those the contractors you're expecting today, the repo men?" The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. It was the heavy, breathless silence of a con artist who has just been cornered under a spotlight. What is she talking about, Gabriel?" I heard William ask in the background, his authoritative tone entirely replaced by wavering confusion. "She's lying. She's making things up because she's jealous." Gabriel shouted, but his voice shook violently. "Don't listen to her, Dad. Hang up the phone." "I also found 3 new platinum credit cards," I continued, speaking clearly so William could hear every single syllable. "Opened in the last 60 days. Total balance of $45,000. The name on the cards is Margaret, but the shipping address for all the purchases goes to Gabriel's private P.O. box. Has Mom been buying high-end recording equipment and designer sneakers lately, Gabriel? Or did you commit identity fraud against your own mother?" "Shut up, shut up." Gabriel screamed, but the line suddenly went dead. He had hung up. I placed my phone face down on the desk. The trap hadn't just snapped shut, it had shattered his entire facade. The rest of the day was a chaotic blur of desperate, escalating tactics from Gabriel. He texted me furiously, a bipolar barrage of messages that swung wildly from vicious, profane threats of physical violence to pathetic, groveling apologies begging me to call off Vanguard. He promised he would pay me back, he promised he would get a real job, he claimed I was destroying the family. I didn't reply to a single one. I simply took screenshots and forwarded them to my lawyer to build an ironclad case for a restraining order. At 3:00 p.m., my father called again. This time, I could hear the exhaustion in his voice. He sounded like an old, broken man. "Lucy," William whispered, "please, you have to stop this. Vanguard sent a property manager to inspect the exterior. They're changing the locks on the garage. Gabriel is out of his mind. He says you fabricated those credit card documents to frame him." "Dad, I didn't fabricate anything," I said softly, though my resolve remained entirely hardened. "Are you really still defending him, after everything?" "He's your brother," William pleaded, grasping at the last shreds of his delusion. He's under a lot of pressure. He made some mistakes, but he's trying to build something. If you show these documents to anyone, you'll ruin his life. He could go to jail for the credit cards." "He ruined his own life, Dad, and he's trying to take you and Mom down with him, again." I took a deep breath, preparing to deliver the final, undeniable blow. "I want you to meet me, just you and Mom, no Gabriel. Come to the private room at the Capitol Grill downtown at 7 o'clock tonight. I will bring the physical proof. I will show you exactly what your son has been doing. But if you bring him, I will walk out and you will never see me again." William hesitated for a long, agonizing moment. The loyalty to his golden child was a deeply ingrained disease, fighting against the undeniable reality crashing down around him. "Okay," he finally conceded, his voice barely a rasp. "Just us, we'll be there." I spent the next 3 hours compiling the ultimate dossier. David, the pie, had outdone himself. He didn't just have the credit card statements, he had security camera footage from the bank showing Gabriel cashing fraudulent checks drawn from William's meager pension account. He had the loan origination documents bearing forged signatures. It was a mountain of irrefutable, undeniable fraud. I printed everything on heavy, premium paper. I organized it into 2 thick, leather-bound folders. I wanted the evidence to feel substantial, heavy, impossible to ignore. Gabriel had spent his entire life manipulating our parents with smoke, mirrors, and empty promises. I was going to dismantle him with cold, hard, documented facts. As I packed the folders into my briefcase, I felt a twinge of sadness. Not for Gabriel, but for the parents I was about to break. They had been terrible to me, they had enabled a monster, but the sheer devastation of realizing your favorite child is a criminal parasite is a pain I wouldn't wish on anyone. Still, they needed to see the truth. They needed to understand exactly who they had chosen to prioritize over me. I arrived at the restaurant early, secured the private dining room, and ordered a glass of expensive Cabernet. I sat at the head of the long oak table, the two leather folders resting ominously in front of me. I checked my watch. 6:55 p.m. The final confrontation was about to begin, and Gabriel's house of cards was about to be utterly annihilated. The heavy mahogany doors of the private dining room groaned softly as they were pushed inward at precisely 7 o'clock. I sat at the head of the long oak table, my hands folded neatly over the two thick, leather-bound folders. The ambient lighting of the Capitol Grill was warm and dim, designed to make patrons feel relaxed and wealthy. But tonight, it only served to cast long, haggard shadows across my parents' faces as they walked in. William and Margaret looked as though they had aged a decade in a single 24-hour period. My father, usually so fastidious about his appearance, was wearing a wrinkled button-down shirt that was misaligned by one button at the collar. His posture, normally rigid and authoritative, had collapsed into a defeated slump. Margaret was clutching her handbag to her chest like a physical shield, her eyes darting nervously around the opulent room, terrified of what was about to happen. "Sit down," I said, my voice calm, projecting across the quiet room. They hesitated, hovering near the doorway as if waiting for permission to enter their own lives. Slowly, they pulled out the heavy leather chairs opposite me and sat. The waiter appeared immediately, pouring sparkling water into their crystal glasses with practiced invisibility before bowing out and firmly shutting the mahogany doors behind him. "Lucy, please," Margaret started, her voice trembling so violently that the water in her glass vibrated. "This whole situation is a terrible misunderstanding. Gabriel is outside in the car. He wants to come in and apologize for losing his temper on the phone. He just wants to explain his business plan to you." My blood ran cold, but I kept my face entirely impassive. "I told you explicitly, Mom. If Gabriel is here, this meeting is over." Before she could respond, the heavy doors violently burst open, crashing loudly against the wooden doorstops. Several patrons in the main dining area turned their heads in alarm. Gabriel stood in the doorway, breathing heavily, his eyes wide and frantic. He looked nothing like the polished, arrogant entrepreneur from Sunday dinner. His designer jacket was stained, his hair was disheveled, and a frantic, animalistic panic radiated from him. "You're not doing this," Gabriel shouted, stepping into the room and pointing a trembling finger at me. "You're not going to sit here and poison them against me. I have a right to defend myself. I have a right to be in this family." The maitre d' appeared behind him, looking deeply concerned. "Ma'am, is everything all right here? Do you need me to call security?" "No," I said, holding up a hand, realizing that this was exactly the semi-public humiliation Gabriel had earned. "He can stay. In fact, I insist he stays. Close the doors, please." The maitre d' hesitated, then pulled the doors shut, trapping the four of us in the suffocating silence of the private room. Gabriel marched up to the table, slamming his hands down on the polished oak. "Whatever she is about to show you is a lie, Dad. She's a corporate drone. She manipulates spreadsheets for a living. She manufactured all of this to steal my inheritance." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I simply reached forward, opened the first leather-bound folder, and slid it across the table toward William. "Dad, open the folder to page 1, I instructed quietly. William, his hands shaking, reached out and flipped the heavy cover open. He stared at the top document. It was a high-resolution printout of the 3 platinum credit card statements. "Those are 3 separate accounts opened in the last 60 days, I explained, leaning back in my chair and watching them carefully. The total balance is $45,620. The primary account holder is Margaret. The shipping address for every single purchase, from the $5,000 audio mixers to the designer watches, is Gabriel's private post office box. Margaret gasped, bringing a hand to her mouth. William, I never opened those cards. I haven't applied for credit in years. She's lying, Gabriel screamed, his voice cracking hysterically. She photoshopped those. Anyone can print a fake bank statement. Turn to page 4, Dad, I commanded, ignoring Gabriel entirely. William slowly turned the pages, his face drained of all color. He let out a low, agonizing groan like a wounded animal. On page 4 were clear, undeniably verified security photographs taken from the interior of a local bank branch. The photographs showed Gabriel standing at the teller counter. That is Gabriel, cashing 3 separate checks drawn directly from your remaining pension account over the last 2 months, I said, my voice steady, delivering the facts like a prosecutor laying out a murder timeline. The total amount stolen from your retirement is $18,000. He forged your signature, Dad. The forensic analyst's report verifying the forgery is on page 5. You took my pension, William whispered, finally looking up from the documents to stare at his golden child. The absolute devastation in my father's eyes was profound. The illusion he had fiercely protected for 31 years was shattering in real time. Gabriel, I trusted you with my account information so you could help me set up the online portal. It was an investment, Dad. Gabriel cried out, stepping back from the table, his hands raised defensively. You don't understand the market. I needed liquidity. I was going to pay it back with 30% interest by the end of the quarter. You would have been thanking me. You weren't investing anything, Gabriel, I interjected, sliding the second leather folder toward my mother. Mom, open that to the first tab. Read the names of the individuals he owes money to. Margaret, sobbing openly now, opened the folder. She blinked through her tears, trying to focus on the terrifying legal documents. Apex Lending, Ironclad Capital. Who are these people, Lucy? They are aggressive, unregulated lenders. Loan sharks, Mom. Gabriel is nearly $200,000 in unsecured debt. The contractors, he said, were coming to the house today. They were debt collectors coming to seize assets. He needed the house because he promised them collateral he didn't own. He was going to let them take your home. No. Gabriel shrieked, slamming his fist into the wall. I had a plan. I just needed a few more weeks. You ruined everything, Lucy. You sold the house out from under us to spite me. I sold the house to protect myself from you, I corrected firmly, standing up from my chair to meet his manic energy. Because I knew the moment you ran out of Mom and Dad's money, you would come for my equity. And I was right. William slowly stood up. He looked at the documents, then at his weeping wife, and finally at the son he had worshipped for decades. The transformation in my father was chilling. The defeated slump vanished, replaced by a rigid, horrifying clarity. He reached across the table, grabbed Gabriel by the lapels of his expensive, fraudulently purchased jacket, and shoved him violently backward toward the doors. Dad, what are you doing? Gabriel panicked, trying to pry his father's hands off him. You stole from your mother, William said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, guttural whisper that echoed through the private dining room. You stole from my pension. You tried to steal your sister's house. You brought criminals to our doorstep. I am your son. Gabriel begged, tears streaming down his face, realizing the manipulation was finally, permanently broken. I am your son. You have to help me fix this. You have to protect me. I have no son, William stated with absolute, icy finality. He shoved Gabriel one last time, sending him stumbling out the mahogany doors into the hallway. Do not come back to whatever apartment we end up in. Do not call your mother. If I ever see you again, I will personally hand these documents to the police. William slammed the heavy mahogany doors shut, locking Gabriel out. The click of the lock echoed like a judge's gavel. William turned around, walked back to the table, and collapsed into his chair, burying his face in his trembling hands. The spell was completely broken. The weeks that followed the confrontation at the Capitol Grill were a blur of grueling reality and necessary healing. Gabriel's downfall was as swift as it was absolute. Without the protective shield of my parents' enabling behavior or the financial sanctuary of the house, his web of lies collapsed entirely. Within 3 days, the predatory lenders he had attempted to defraud caught up to him. He was forced to declare immediate, catastrophic bankruptcy. Furthermore, because Vanguard Property Holdings had legally assumed ownership of the estate, Gabriel's attempt to stall the eviction resulted in the local sheriff's department physically removing him from the property, a humiliating spectacle that his creditors eagerly witnessed from the street. I received word through David, my private investigator, that Gabriel had eventually fled the state, desperately trying to outrun the massive fraud charges that the banks were beginning to officially file against him. He was a ghost, a cautionary tale of entitlement and deceit. As for William and Margaret, the reality of their situation was a harsh, unforgiving awakening. Vanguard Property Holdings gave them a strict 2-week grace period to vacate the premises. Stripped of their delusions and their golden child, they had to face the terrifying prospect of true financial independence in their 60s. I did not abandon them, though I established unshakable, permanent boundaries. I used my professional network to secure them a modest, clean, 2-bedroom apartment in a safe, quiet neighborhood, co-signing the lease purely out of a lingering sense of familial duty, but refusing to pay a single cent of their rent. I also hired a forensic accountant, entirely on my dime, to help them navigate the identity theft Gabriel had committed. We managed to freeze the fraudulent credit accounts and slowly untangle the mess he had made of William's remaining pension, saving them from total destitution. 3 months after the disastrous Sunday dinner, my parents asked me to come over to their new apartment. I drove my car, the one Gabriel had always mocked as too practical, and parked in the designated visitor spot. The apartment was small, the ceilings were low, and the furniture from the massive suburban house looked cramped and out of place in the tiny living room. William and Margaret sat on the sofa, looking incredibly humbled. The arrogance that had defined their parenting for my entire life had completely evaporated. "Lucy," William began, his voice rough with emotion. He couldn't meet my eyes at first. He stared at his hands, which were resting nervously on his knees. "We asked you here today because we owe you the deepest, most profound apology a parent can give a child." Margaret reached out, her eyes swimming with tears, and gently placed her hand over mine. "We were so blind, my sweet girl. We were so completely, foolishly blind. We poured everything into Gabriel, and we expected you to just carry the weight. We treated you like an employee, not a daughter. We took your generosity, your hard work, and your love, and we tried to hand it to a monster. When you left those keys on the table," William continued, finally looking up, his eyes shining with unshed tears, "you didn't just walk out of the house. You forced us to wake up. You saved us from him, Lucy. If you hadn't sold the property, if you hadn't investigated him, he would have left us homeless and in prison for his debts. We owe you our lives." I sat quietly, listening to the words I had waited over 3 decades to hear. The anger, the profound resentment that had calcified in my chest for so long, slowly began to crack and dissolve. I didn't forget the pain they had caused. I didn't forget the years of neglect. But looking at them now, 2 aging, broken people who had finally recognized my worth, I felt a wave of genuine, healing peace wash over me. "I forgive you," I said softly, the words feeling incredibly liberating as they left my mouth. "But things have to be different now. There are no more bailouts. There are no more blank checks. We rebuild this family on honesty, or we don't rebuild it at all." "We understand," William nodded vigorously, tears finally spilling down his weathered cheeks. "Whatever you say, Lucy, whatever you need." I stayed for tea. We talked, truly talked, for the first time in my adult life. We didn't talk about Gabriel. We didn't talk about money. We talked about my career, my interests, and my life. Later that evening, I drove back to my new home. I had used a portion of the equity from the house sale to purchase a stunning, modern penthouse overlooking the financial district. I walked through the heavy oak doors, relishing the absolute silence and the panoramic view of the sparkling city lights. I poured myself a glass of wine and stepped out onto the balcony, feeling the cool night breeze against my face. The heavy, suffocating burden of the family home was gone forever. I had fought for my autonomy, I had exposed the darkness, and I had emerged victorious. For the first time in my life, the future belonged entirely to me.